Welcome to the Dealmaking with Laura DiFrancesco podcast. I'm Laura DiFrancesco, your host. We're talking all about mergers and acquisitions, buying and selling small businesses, as well as corporate law. We are taking our experience closing over $10 billion of transactions since founding Dean Street Law 5 years ago, and my experience being an M&A and corporate attorney for over a decade and making it accessible to you as an entrepreneur. I hope that this helps you in navigating the complex world of mergers and acquisitions. And also, we're always happy to be a resource for you here at Dean Street Law. You can always apply to work with us through our complimentary consultations linked in our show notes. And a huge shout out and thank you to everyone who's subscribed and left us a 5-star review. If you haven't yet, be sure to subscribe and also leave us a 5-star review. It's one of the best ways to support us as a small business. And also be sure to share with your friends and colleagues on social media, through text, email, or however is easiest. It means the world to us that you're supporting our content and helps us make more to support you in your journey. Welcome back to another episode of the Dealmaking with Laura DiFrancesco podcast. I'm your host, Laura DiFrancesco, founder of Dean Street Law. At Dean Street Law, we've closed over $10 billion of transactions since founding Dean Street Law 5 years ago. In addition to that, we specialize in lower middle market mergers and acquisitions, particularly in the entrepreneurship through acquisition space. So I'm using my over 10 years of experience negotiating mergers and acquisitions to make this information accessible for buyers and sellers, buying and selling small businesses, so that you can hopefully improve your deal-making skills. Today's topic is all about structuring transactions where there is a licensed business. This is one of the most frequent questions that we receive on consultation calls and from our community. Do you do deals for licensed businesses? And the answer is, of course, yes. It's probably almost at least 50% of the transactions that we do. There are all different types of licensed businesses. We're going to be talking more in depth about where you find these types of transactions, how it impacts the legal aspects of your acquisition or selling your business, the different nuances of licensing regulations across the United States and industries, how to transition a licensed business, whether that business is licensed through the individual or through the business, or a permutation or amalgamation of both, and how you can plan for success through this, and of course have wonderful support from the legal side of things as well. We're happy to be your trusted legal advisor on your transaction at Dean Street Law. You can always schedule a complimentary consultation through the link in our show notes to chat more about this topic and others with respect to a deal that you have, whether you're buying or selling your business. So let's talk about the specifics of licensed businesses. When do you see this come about, and how do you address it? First of all, there are so many different types of more heavily regulated industries and professions where you will see this. In addition, certain states are more heavily regulated than others. So things like healthcare, med spas, contractors, electricians, plumbers, trades, finance, insurance, alcohol, cannabis. There are so many different types of licensed businesses, and those are going to be some of the most prevalent. But it is an important question to ask in your pre-LOI due diligence is this a licensed business? Because one of the most important things to understand is when a license is necessary in a business, because even where a business is licensed, that does not mean that they have all of the licenses that they need to, which we help you figure out in due diligence. Because if a business is a licensed business, let's say they do environmental testing, they may have to have a license in every state that they do business in. And whether they keep that license active or not is a very important question that we assist with in the due diligence phase. So understanding if it's a licensed business and whether that business is held by the business itself, an individual, if that individual has to be an owner, and what those licensing requirements are going to be a few of your elements that will definitely impact your transaction structure and overall a lot of the terms that you're going to negotiate within your transaction, including the transition timeline, key employment agreements, and more. Now, states specifically each have different licensing requirements. So if you buy a plumbing business in North Carolina and a plumbing business in Virginia, they are likely to have different licensing requirements. They may even have different licensing requirements with whether the license is held by the business, an individual, or whether it has to be held by the owner. So each of these questions are going to be different from state to state, industry to industry, business to business. So when we get asked, can we work on this type of transaction? The answer is typically yes, because this is the question that comes up every time, and it's going to be different every time based on all the different nuances of each transaction. I will say, if you're looking for a state where almost everything has to be licensed, that would be California, where even painters need to be licensed. Even the different types of trades that you would not think would need to be licensed need to be licensed. So that's just one aspect, but every single state is different. So every state in which they do business, every state in which you are considering a business, all have different rules and requirements that we will dive into in the due diligence phase of the transaction. Now, in terms of impact on the transaction, that can be numerous. It can impact the timeline, because if there is a need to transition that license and you're waiting on a governmental entity, you don't even know what kind of bag of worms that you just opened. So it's always best to try to structure a transaction wherever possible, where government consent is not necessary. That's not always possible, but you do try to structure it that way whenever you can. One of the biggest things with licensed businesses is a lot of times it may be a stock sale or a sale of the membership interests or the equity or ownership interests in the business. If the business holds the license, but that is subject to being able to do that without government approval. Sometimes you have to provide notice. There's a whole bunch of nuances with that. So it's not necessarily going to make it safe proof, but it is generally what you see in a lot of licensed businesses, because in a licensed business, that is just one element that typically complicates it. It doesn't necessarily mean it has to. Sometimes asset purchases are okay. It's really all going to be driven by due diligence and what we find when we're looking over those licensing requirements. So when you're thinking about your letter of intent, you do want to structure it so that it could be an asset purchase or a stock purchase or purchase of membership interests, so that you have flexibility in your purchase structure if the need arises through your due diligence, through looking at these licensing requirements to make a switch in terms of acquisition structure. And then timeline, it is going to impact timeline as well, whether you're getting that consent or you need to make sure you negotiate key employment agreements with key employees who may have the license. We're going to talk about that in a little bit more detail later, but those elements do need to be taken into consideration when considering timing, because you are ultimately adding third parties to your negotiations that will influence your ability to close in a timely manner. So trying to close a deal like this in 45 days or under 60 days, you're going to be very hard pressed. I would say you're looking at least a 90 to 120 day time frame, depending on how many third party consents or cooperation is needed. And if you're talking about governmental consent, just have an open-ended timeline, because you never know. It could take way, way more than 3 or 4 months. It could take 6 months, a year. It may just be slow as molasses. So we don't know. You want to be able to make sure that you're successful no matter what. So when your attorney is drafting these provisions around timing, that they are more fluid provisions and not drop deadlines that just expire and then the parties go their separate ways, even though everybody's done all their work and we're just waiting on government approval or something like that. There's a lot that you can do when structuring, perhaps signing a purchase agreement and then getting the government approval or getting the key employees on board or something like that. So there's a lot of things that you can do to stage it so that you can secure the deal and make sure that the deal will be going through, subject to receiving these third-party consents or third-party involvement, but not be derailed by them. So you want to make sure you have an open timeline, or as open as possible, that the parties will agree to when you are negotiating elements such as this. When it comes to navigating corporate law, entrepreneurship, and managing small businesses, experience matters. Dean Street Law is a boutique corporate firm specializing in mergers and acquisitions, and additional focus in real estate, commercial transactions, finance, and corporate governance. With over $10 billion in deals closed, Dean Street Law has extensive experience representing hundreds of clients in thousands of transactions, from small businesses to Fortune 500 companies. Whether you need startup guidance or advice on closing multi-million or multi-billion-dollar deals, we're your trusted partner every step of the way. Visit deanstreetlaw.com in the show notes to schedule a complimentary consultation. Let's talk about the distinction between the licensing being held at the business level versus the individual level versus the owner level. So when you're thinking of the various state regulations in all of these licensed businesses, you have to carefully understand, which your lawyer will help you with, but it will drive deal structure and the terms you'll be negotiating. You have to understand whether the license is held by the business, by an individual who may be an employee, or by the owner. In addition, you have to understand that whole licensing process. How long does it usually take? How hard would it be for another employee to be licensed? How many employees or owners are licensed? Do you have plan A, plan B, transition plan? Would you as the buyer want to become licensed to avoid any disruption to the business should your key employees fall through or something like that? So you have to kind of understand the lay of the land of where the business license is held in the business, in the individual, in an owner, or sometimes both and many. And once you understand those state-specific laws and how they vary and what the specifics are around ownership, then you can start to outline that transition plan from the seller to the buyer and how to structure that, how to involve key employees, how easy is it for the key employees to get a license if they don't have it already? Could they be a stand-in for the owner? Other questions to ask are, of course, is the seller interested in letting the buyer use the license for a time period? There are certain sellers who are comfortable with that. They've built a great relationship with the buyer. There's a lot of trust there. And there are other sellers that don't feel comfortable with that because that's their professional license and their professional responsibility. And if they're not going to be involved in the business in a material way, controlling and influencing the business, they may not feel comfortable. So you have to figure out what that comfort level is. I will say the market standard is that there is some level of transition and transition time period, and the general level of control and influence that the seller would have if they're transitioning would dissipate over time as that replacement comes in. When you're thinking about having stand-ins, let's say the license must be held by an owner of the business, there's a couple of different ways that you could transition that. First off, the seller could remain an owner, even a 1% owner, if that's permissible based on the regulations, to maintain ownership and enable the buyer to have time to apply for that license or have a key employee become an owner if they have that license or something like that. So ownership is one way to transition it, and you could have a put option, a right to sell, or an obligation to sell or divest that ownership interest once the license is obtained in another way. We just did a podcast episode on the put options, so you should be sure to tune in and subscribe for more videos and to also check that out. So you can have an exit mechanism where there is a transition piece where the seller will retain ownership for a designated period of time where the buyer is obtaining the license. You also want to have backup plans as well. So having at least 1 to 2 minimum key employees who have this license or could obtain this license or could factor in would be helpful. So if the license is not held by the business, it's held by individuals, you need to make sure that there's always at least one individual at any given time that has a license that will be able to hold the license for the company. Now, sometimes it's super easy. Let's say you have electricians who have the amount of years and experience needed to be licensed as a master electrician. Well, that's easy. Maybe they just need to go through the process of applying, taking a test, or registering in some way. And so you may have a business with the infrastructure where there can be someone who steps in the place. If not, you have to be talking to the seller about, as the buyer, how can we transition this? How can you stay on board? How can I get this license or someone else gets this license so that we have a few backup plans? And then in addition to that, you want to make sure that in your key employment agreements, you have obligations, and this is all stuff that we work on in our engagement and everything, but you have an obligation for the key employee to be an employee for a certain period of time without leaving, because that will make sure that you're able to get a plan B in place. And then also, if they do plan to leave, that there must be a certain amount of notice so that you can have someone else come into the place and you can make sure that the license is properly transferred and everything. Most of the time, if a buyer is purchasing a licensed business, if there's not 1 to 2 people as backup, they will also get that license themselves. Or if they're planning on building out a platform company, let's say they want to do a roll up in the electrician space and they want to make sure that they are purchasing 20 electric companies, that they may get the license themselves, just to make sure that if something happens somewhere, they have the ability to continue operating the business. Because of course, the implications, if you do not have the license, is that you cannot operate, and then all the dollars that you spent, hundreds of thousands, millions, tens of millions, and more, are worthless because you're then unable to operate the business. And that's not a situation anyone wants to be in. That's why I say you want to make sure you have a transition plan, and then backup A, backup B, potentially even the buyer having the license, to make sure that business continuity will never be an issue. That is the goal. And then when you're also considering this transition plan, a lot of the time the seller will want to taper their involvement. They may not be heavily involved on a day-to-day basis. They may not be working 40 hours a week anymore. Nevertheless, it is important to make sure it's a realistic taper and make sure that it's going to be a mutually beneficial transition, because especially in licensed businesses, they tend to be highly technical and there tends to be a lot more involved in the transition of the business. So it is important to make sure that that business transition is satisfactory. It might be on a ownership transition, it might be an employment transition or a consulting transition. If it's hourly, it's probably going to be something akin to the comparable market rate for that role, but it may be a little bit more if there's more that they're doing in addition to that. If you are funding the transaction through an SBA loan, that's really important to note as well, because the requirement and maximum at this time on January 21st of 2025 is that the seller cannot be employee or independent contractor or consultant for over a year. And so you have to make sure, when you're understanding all of the application processes and transition processes and registrations that need to be done, making sure that gets done immediately after closing and well in advance of that time period, because you do have a hard cutoff with the SBA loans to make sure that that transition is complete. Very important to understand and think about. Of course, during the due diligence process, you'll work with your attorney in understanding that license application process, whether that's transferring a new license, whether that's something that's from the business or key employees or the seller, any permutation of that, and really build that into your transaction timeline and understand the potential for delay. That's why I said, is if you're transitioning after closing, as soon as that closing occurs, that should be your number one priority, is getting your backup in place, making sure that you have the transition done as early as possible, because you don't want this to be a business continuity issue for any reason. Heaven forbid something were to happen with the seller. Heaven forbid something were to happen with person backup A. You want to make sure you have business continuity that will never be an issue in licensed businesses. And in addition, really important as you're going through this process with the buyer and seller to really be conscientious and fair to one another and work together collaboratively to find a solution for transition, because as a license holder myself who's licensed to practice law, I would be extremely hard pressed to allow someone to have unfettered use of my license. That just wouldn't work for me. And so any license holder is probably going to be pretty similar. So it's really important to understand that license holder's concerns and make sure that the terms of the engagement are fair for all parties to respect the duties and obligations of a license holder, while also maintaining business continuity and making sure that the business can run successfully as a whole. Thinking about buying a business? Unlock the secrets of successful acquisitions with Acquisition Insights, your legal roadmap for success. With over 81 modules of video lectures, written materials, guides, and checklists, we provide in-depth guidance to navigate every step of the process. From initial interest to closing the deal, get the expertise you need to make informed decisions. You can also access our battle-tested templates in the Acquisition Insights course and templates bundle, including our template LOIs, letters of intent, pre- and post-LOI due diligence request list, material deal terms lists, and more. Visit lauradifrancesco.co/the-shop today and take the first step towards buying your dream business. All the links are in the show notes. All of this to say, that's all going to inform your transaction plan and your transition plan. Your transaction plan is going to be how all of these elements come together to consider transition planning, whether that's ownership or key employees or you getting a license, whatever the case may be, making sure that all of those considerations are coming together, that you're having good proactive conversations between the buyer and seller, good proactive conversations with your attorney. I would build this into the letter of intent. These are pre-LOI due diligence questions I would be having that I would then do confirmatory due diligence on, so that you have a plan. Of course, this is impacted whether it's a competitive or non-competitive letter of intent, but to the greatest extent possible, the transition of a license in a business should be in the LOI and should be a key consideration. In addition, that will be followed up by due diligence. Your attorney will do a lot of due diligence, reviewing the laws, making sure that everything that the seller thinks is true, that the business has the licenses in all the states that the business needs the license in to operate, and that you have a sustainable, successful plan for the transition and the transaction as a whole. They will assist you with timelines. That's why as soon as we start working on a transaction, we put together 3 things that I've never heard of any attorney doing as soon as a letter of intent is signed, which is a closing checklist and timeline, which is going to include all the things that you need to do to get to closing, which will include these aspects of as well. Your material deal terms list, which will outline key employees and their terms, and the transition plan with the seller as well. And of course, we also put together the due diligence request list. There will be a lot more due diligence on a licensed business than a non-licensed business for these reasons, because you have to look over state regulations, you have to look over compliance with those regulations, and how from a day-to-day perspective and a transition perspective, those will be implicated in due diligence and the transaction as a whole. In addition, your attorney, if necessary, will also prepare regulatory compliance communications or any applications that may be necessary. Depending on the application, may be easy enough for the business owner to handle, or maybe something that the lawyer will put together for them as well. And especially the key employment agreements, those are critical, whether they are 2 pages or 10 pages. or more. Those are really important to make sure that there is not just employment, but an obligation of employment, continued employment to maintain that business continuity. Those are just a few things that we think about when we're thinking about structuring transactions for licensed businesses. Those are really just the starting point, the things that we start to dig into and then continue to expand from there, because oftentimes licensed businesses also have more nuanced contracts. They may have assignment issues as well mixed in there. These are the starting points, the conversation starters, and then we go into further detail from there. If you need assistance in transitioning and transferring a licensed business, whether it be a med spa, a electrician company, a plumbing company, a painting business, whatever the case may be, feel free to reach out to us. Schedule a complimentary consultation. We would love to learn more about your transaction and support you in any way that you can. This came about from many conversations on consultations and one of the biggest questions we get asked. So if there is a topic that you would love to hear about, I'd love to know in the comments on social media. Be sure to share this with a colleague and friend, comment, like, subscribe, show your support with a 5-star review. Anything you can do to support our small business would mean the absolute world to us. Cheers and happy deal making. I will see you in the next episode of Deal Making with Laura DiFrancesco. Thank you so much for joining us on this episode of the Dealmaking with Laura DiFrancesco podcast. I hope you found today's discussion insightful and that it brought you one step closer to mastering the art of mergers and acquisitions. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to follow and subscribe to Dealmaking with Laura DiFrancesco on your favorite podcast platform so you never miss an episode. And if you found value in our discussion, please leave a 5-star review. It would mean the world to us, and share this podcast with your network, friends, and colleagues. For more in-depth resources, be sure to visit our website, deanstreetlaw.com, where you can find articles, guides, and more information on our services. Don't forget to follow us on social media for the latest episodes, updates, tips, and exclusive content. You can find us on LinkedIn, search Funder, at LMDFrancesco on X, and at Dean Street Law on Instagram. Join us on our next episode where we'll explore more deal-making insights. Cheers and happy deal making.